only one who thinks the Bible can be a little bit confusing sometimes. I mean, how do you actually make sense of it? How do you understand what the text is communicating? I mean, can you understand what the text is communicating? Or should we just rely on what other people tell us? Those are all really good questions, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Today, we're going to be considering how we actually understand and read the Bible. And to do that, what we're going to need to do is to look at what we maybe call interpretive methods and how we actually interpret Scripture. But in order to do that first, I just want to recap where we've been in this latest series of videos. See, in the series on how to read the Bible, and if you've missed any of those videos, you can go back and find them on this playlist, How to Read the Bible. We've considered why we read. Why we read fundamentally is to meet Jesus. And maybe, as I was thinking about this and just kind of interacting with some people, and one of the challenges I think people have is they can think of this so like kind of supernaturally, kind of some kind of mystical experience. And while I don't want to discount that, and do want to say, yes, there is an encounter with Jesus that can happen when we read Scripture. But at another very basic level, I mean, just understand that Jesus is the man of truth. I mean, Jesus taught his disciples, he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Another maybe way of saying that, communicating that in language that kind of makes sense in our psychologized world, is that Jesus is the truth that guides us to the ultimate revelation of reality, right? Jesus is the pathway. And so when we read Scripture to meet Jesus, ultimately it is a reckoning with the truth itself, but truth embodied in a person, which I think is really important and valuable to consider. So why we read is to meet with Jesus, to encounter the risen, resurrected Jesus. Last series of videos, the last few that we did, were on what the Bible actually is, how it's became the Bible that we have today, what went into it being organized, how it's organized, some of those kind of practical, technical questions. But what we're going to be looking at today specifically is interpretation and method, how we read. And there's two parts to it, interpretation and method. Our next video is going to be on method. This video is on interpretation. And when we think about interpretation, I think for me, it's a bit like Where's Waldo, right? It's a bit like Where's Waldo. Anybody remember this? You probably do. Where's Waldo is this kind of interesting, bizarre little book where you have to find Waldo on all the pages, like on this, and it's kind of hard to see where he is. And I remember as a kid going, this was published in 1989, The Great Waldo Search. Probably the best of the Waldo series in my opinion, but that's debatable, I guess. So I remember going through this as a kid and sitting down with my dad and looking through the pages, and I quickly realized that there was something that made this a lot easier to find Waldo. You may be able to see it right there. See where Waldo is? Yeah, you do. You know why you see where Waldo is? Because he was circled with Sharpie. Because that's what my sister did when she went through and found Waldo on every single page. She circled him in Sharpie. Now, if there was no Sharpie, it is much harder to find Waldo. I would not know that from this book because I have never experienced this book unsharpied. But I am told that it's much harder, and I can imagine that it's so. The challenge for all of us, I think, when it comes to the Bible, and what Waldo has to do with the Bible, is that I think a lot of us approach the biblical text like, Where's Waldo? And it just is this kind of confusing, jumbled mess. And we're trying to find the meaning, i.e. Waldo, in the text, in this big, jumbled and confusing mess, but it's really hard to do. And I think what a lot of us are looking for is just the circled Sharpie to kind of make it easier for us. Part of what's really valuable in biblical study and engagement with the text, part of it is the process, the struggle, the training, the journey of actually finding the meaning. But the other part of it too is that there are some very practical, helpful tips and methods when it comes to interpretation that are like the Sharpie circling Waldo on the page, which is what I want us to consider a bit today. And I think a helpful guide for us is not necessarily Martin Hanford, though I'm sure he's an amazing guy. I don't actually know that. If you know Martin Hanford, drop it in the comments and let him know. I mean, love Waldo. But, and please refrain from any Waldo is demonic comments. I have no idea, but I'm sure that's a thing that someone somewhere believes. It was just a book. So our guide is not Waldo through this journey of interpretation, but I'm actually going to go to the Apostle John, who wrote down this vision that he received that we call revelation, which the word revelation, I mean, it is a translation of the Greek word apocalypsos, from which we get the modern word apocalypse. An apocalypse, quite literally, is just a revealing of what is and what will be, perhaps, but certainly just a revealing. So that's where revelation comes from. So John, writing in Revelation, has some really helpful instruction on biblical interpretation. That's where we're going to look. This comes from Revelation 5. The Apostle John writes, he says, "Then I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides, and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?'" And so this picture that we see is John in kind of the heavenly throne room, and God seated on the throne. And in his right hand, he has the very words of God, the scroll of God in his right hand. And yet it's sealed with 7 seals, a seal of completeness and perfection that cannot be opened. And the question that the angel asks is, who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll? That's a telling question. It's a question that a lot of people have in our world today. Who is worthy? Not just who is able. That's a question in and of itself. It's not who is able to unravel the mysteries of God, but who is worthy to unravel and open up the mysteries of God. That's what, at one level, that's what interpretation is. Interpretation is making sense of the biblical text or making meaning from it. And there we have to make an important point, which is that we all interpret Scripture, and we all interpret all sorts of things every single day. Interpretation isn't just your opinion, it's just how you make sense of things. Some people, especially growing up in East Tennessee, and this is something that I heard a lot, like I was told as a kid, they either have to interpret the Bible entirely literally or not, because it's a book, and so you have to take it all as it is. Well, hopefully, as we've seen, as we've gone through this series on what the Bible is and how it's organized and where it comes from, hopefully we've seen how extremely unhelpful that is for advice, and just how wrong that is too. You can't interpret everything the same way, because there are different genres and different authors and different contexts, and so it literally is impossible to do so. More on that in a second. Some people will say, though, and this is what I heard, is that I interpret the Bible literally. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, like we said. The truth is that no, you don't. You do interpret it, and you do read metaphor and idiom in the text, and you're okay with that. In a lot of different places. And so we just have to acknowledge that literal interpretation is a bit of a loaded term that doesn't really mean as much as we think it does. At one level, in the very original sense of the word literal, it means in accordance with the author's intention. And so if the author's intention was to write a metaphor, then a literal interpretation of the metaphor would be metaphorical. Or if the author's intention is to write a parable, then a literal interpretation of the parable would be that it is a parable, a story. We all interpret. But there are a few different approaches that I think are helpful for us to consider, which, depending on personality, some of us will gravitate towards more than others. In technical language, these interpretive approaches are called hermeneutics. That's a Greek word, hermeneutics. It's just an interpretive method or approach. And there's really 3 that we'll talk about. And I've kind of broken there's so many, right? But I've kind of broken them down into 3 broad categories that I think will be helpful for us to think about. The first is what I'd call a top-down hermeneutic, kind of a top-down approach, which is that there isn't much accounting for the text itself in terms of its context within the broader text, in terms of its history. The question really becomes, what are we supposed to believe about this? It's where we take the text and we appeal to a higher authority who will tell us how we're supposed to interpret. The positive of this is that it does force us to check in with someone who is much wiser than us. The negative of this is that sometimes it is not very critical and we just believe whatever we're told to believe. Pros and cons. Another approach that we'll consider is what we call the bottom-up approach. the bottom-up method of interpretation, which is essentially that meaning is derived from how I take it, from how I apply this to my own life. It's a very subjective approach and a very subjective interpretation. The pro is that it does often take account my experiences. The con here, and I hope you might be able to see this, is that you're not really reading with your head, and that it can be, not always, it can be a very arrogant kind of approach where I discount 2,000 plus years of tradition and reading and interpretation. And there's another, approach that I want us to consider, which is something that John talks about here. This is what John says. He says, no one in heaven or on earth, this is verses 3 through 4, no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it. I wept and wept because no one was found who was worthy to open the scroll or look inside. Now that's discouraging, right? That is absolutely discouraging. But what I think, there is hope though. So just, hold on. Don't turn off the video quite yet because there's some positives to it. It's a bit like, walking into a room with your sunglasses on. And that you walk into the room, have you ever done that? I mean, I do that now. It's like approaching summer here in East Tennessee, and I will do this quite a lot. And you'll forget. I mean, I will. I won't speak for you, but I forget sometimes, and I have my sunglasses on. I'm like, man, it's really dark in here. I turn the light on, and it's like, man, it's still really dark in here. It's like, oh yeah, I have my sunglasses on. Is that a lot of times it's just kind of the human condition means that we will approach the biblical text. We will approach this seeking and the pursuit of truth with sunglasses on. That things will appear kind of dark and cloudy and mysterious to us. But what we really need to do is to find the right lens. Maybe to take off the shaded lens and put on like a prescription lens, or whatever the case may be. You need to have the right lens, the right hermeneutic, the right interpretive method. And then most of us, most of the time with the Bible, are like people walking around with sunglasses inside. And this is a real struggle for us. And it is such a challenge because the Bible is so diverse and so different even within itself. And you just can't interpret everything exactly the same way. Kind of like I talked about, like the advice that I was given as a kid when reading the Bible. I mean, just thinking about this today, actually, because I'm reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel, which tells the story of the rise of David as the king of Israel, the kind of the first unifying king of Israel, his rise and then his reign and then eventually his death at the end of 2nd Samuel. And throughout this, there are a number of different events that happen in David's life. And so in 1st and 2nd Samuel, you kind of read about the history of those events. But then you can also read about David's subjective experience in the Psalms of these same events. And David's writing in the Psalms is often poetry. It's often written as song or prayer. And so you can't interpret those two kinds of things the same way, even though they are about the same events. Does that make sense? I hope that it does. One is the individual's kind of subjective poetic experience, and the other one is a little more objective historical observation. And those are very different things, so they can't really be interpreted the same exact way. Which is why I think the text continues on in Revelation 5 and why it's so helpful. Because there's so many confusing parts in Scripture sometimes. I mean, there's violence in the Old Testament. There's, stories like Abraham being called to sacrifice Isaac. There's the persecution of the church in the New Testament, the conquest of Canaan by Joshua. There's the book of Judges. Go read that sometime. And how do we make sense of all of that stuff? How do we make sense of the laws in the Old Testament and in relation to the New Testament? And why do we not keep those laws? How do you understand this stuff? Okay, Revelation 5 says, "Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.' Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes," which, if that sounds as confusing, this is metaphorical, poetic imagery. 7 is in many examples in the biblical texts is this number of completeness and of perfection, of like a teleological, ultimate purpose, orientation, right? Kind of a teleological orientation. That's what 7 represents. So 7 horns, 7, like complete power, 7 eyes, complete vision and wisdom. See, it's just a helpful thing. These are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. Now, as much as we can really get sucked into kind of the explaining the metaphor, and which all of that would come from maybe what we call a historical critical approach, where you consider the history and the context and the authorship and the genre, and you kind of really dig into the scholarship of this stuff. As helpful as all of that can be, there is a much deeper point that John is making that is really helpful for us when it comes to interpretation. Did you catch it? It says, who is worthy to break the seal and open the scroll? And the angel eventually replies, he says, John, don't weep. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, he has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. And then it's this vision of this Lamb who has been slain that is standing in the center of the throne room, who is the one who can open the scroll. Here's the point. Jesus, crucified and resurrected, is the one who can break the seals and open the scroll. It is Jesus, crucified and resurrected, that must stand at the center of our interpretation. If you want to make sense of the entirety of Scripture, then our hermeneutic needs to be Jesus, crucified and risen from the dead. We call this, like in technical language, a Christological hermeneutic, but that Jesus is the lens. Jesus, crucified and resurrected, is the lens through which we understand and interpret the broader corpus of Scripture. So when we look at things like the conquest of Canaan, and when we look at things like Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, we can see Jesus crucified, the gift of God's own self to us. And we hear those parallels in the text. When we read about things like the conquest of Canaan, we can see Jesus, the one who brings us into the promised land, and Jesus, the one who will one day break every bow and shatter every spear and bring peace upon the earth. And when we read just really kind of confusing things like some of the laws in the Old Testament, we put Jesus crucified there as the atonement for our sin and brokenness in this world, and the one who brings us back into right relationship with God, and the one who fulfills the law and all the prophets. It is Jesus, crucified and resurrected, who is our interpretive method. I hope that's helpful for you. Love to hear if you have any questions or comments or concerns on that. Drop those in the comment section, or do reach out and send us an email. Let us know. You can find all that stuff in the links below in this post. We'd also love to hear if you have any questions about the Bible. I mean, most of all, what do you think? We'd love to hear from you. So like this video if you found it helpful, comment on it, do share with a friend if you think that would be useful for them, and let us know how we can pray for you. And kind of final thing that I'm supposed to say, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you have not done so already. Y'all take care, have a great week, make a great day, and we'll catch you in the next video where we're going to be talking about interpretive or method on how we actually read the Bible. Interpretation this time, method next time. I'll get my words out. Y'all have a great week.